What happens when a woman who's spent her whole life being overlooked walks into the wrong room? Claire Whitmore wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to spill tea on her blouse. She wasn't supposed to meet the eyes of a man like Graham Ashford, a cold, unreachable CEO with too many closed doors and not enough words. But she did. And from that moment, everything changed. She was just a secretary on a 6-month trial. He was the kind of man who didn't believe in second chances. So, how did a quiet winter in a small New Hampshire town become the setting for a storm neither of them saw coming? Why did a silent man leave notes instead of flowers? Why did a woman who'd sworn never to fall again start to listen to the spaces between his words? And when the world turned against her, why did he finally choose to speak? This isn't a story about being rescued. It's a story about being seen. If you've ever felt invisible, forgotten, or silenced, this story is for you. Like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. And let's begin. It had started as one of those mornings, cold, gray, and rushed. Snow clung to the corners of Hanover's sidewalks like old memories, stubborn and unwilling to melt. Claire's boots were still damp when she stepped into the building. Her fingertips tingled from the wind, the kind of dry, biting cold that slipped under coats and through sleeves, settling in the bones like regret. She had only been working at Ashford Realty for 3 weeks, still new enough that faces blurred together, and hallway doors looked far too similar for someone trying not to be noticed. She had memorized the layout of her floor, but hadn't ventured upstairs, certainly not to the executive level. That morning, however, the routine had broken. A burst of nervous energy followed the sound of a printer jam in the admin lounge. Claire had printed the revised investment summary late the night before, after double-checking the numbers a third time. Her fingers had trembled slightly as she adjusted the staples. This report mattered her first task of real responsibility. She clutched the manila folder like it was a lifeline, determined to deliver it herself. Then came the tea spill. A clumsy elbow while reaching for a napkin had knocked the cup off the break room table. It wasn't hot enough to burn, but the amber stain bloomed over her ivory blouse like shame. Flustered, she took the elevator without thinking, pressing the wrong button and stepping out onto the executive floor, polished oak floors. Silent walls, art that didn't try to be understood. She didn't belong there. She knew it. But the hallway looked just familiar enough, and her mind was focused on whether the stain would dry before anyone noticed. The door at the end of the corridor stood slightly ajar. She knocked, once, softly, no answer. Voices murmured inside, muffled, clipped. She opened the door just wide enough to slip in. What she stepped into was not a mailroom, not an assistant's office, not anything remotely close to where she was supposed to be. It was the boardroom, long, heavy table, 10 chairs filled, eyes turned to her like she'd stepped on stage mid-play, unaware she was in costume. Some blinked. One woman raised an eyebrow. A man on the far end coughed into his hand. Claire froze. Her heart slammed against her chest with the embarrassing weight of someone who'd made a very visible mistake. Her breath hitched. She tried to speak, but the sound caught in her throat. Then she saw him. Graham Ashford. He sat at the head of the table, posture like carved granite, face unreadable. His hair, salt and pepper, was combed back, immaculately neat. A dark navy suit framed him, but it was his eyes that made Claire's hands tighten around the folder. He looked directly at her, not surprised, not annoyed, just quiet. It was the kind of silence that didn't beg to be broken. It stood on its own, a presence more powerful than words. And yet, it wasn't cruel. Claire took a shaky step backward, murmured an apology that didn't sound like a word at all. In her clumsy retreat, the folder slipped from her grasp, papers fanning out onto the wood floor like scattered snow. No one moved. She dropped to her knees to collect them, fingers fumbling. Her breath came faster now, more from shame than from exertion. Still, no one helped. And then he spoke. "Leave it." His voice wasn't sharp. It was low, calm, measured, like everything about him had been rehearsed 100 times before speaking. Claire looked up. The room blurred slightly at the edges, but she saw his expression clearly. Still no judgment, no amusement either, just observation. As though he were watching a puzzle he couldn't quite piece together. She stood slowly, the folder limp in her hands, pages askew, her blouse, still damp, clung to her side like a reminder that she didn't fit here, didn't belong. "Sorry," she whispered, but no one answered. She turned and left, closing the door as gently as she could behind her, trying not to let the click sound like defeat. The hallway outside was colder than she remembered. Her hands trembled as she pressed the elevator button. The moment stretched long, the hallway empty except for the echo of her own mistake. She could feel their eyes on her still, even through closed doors. But one gaze stayed with her more than the others. Graham Ashford hadn't looked away. He hadn't smirked. He hadn't looked disgusted or impatient. He had just watched her. There was something unsettling about that, about being seen so fully and yet not dismissed. She would have preferred indifference. Indifference was safer. Back at her desk, Claire smoothed her blouse and sat down slowly, trying to quiet her breathing. The warmth of the office heater barely touched her skin. She stared at the folder in her lap, still slightly damp at the corners, and wondered what damage had been done. But deeper than the embarrassment, deeper than the creeping fear of professional ruin, was a question she couldn't shake. Why hadn't he looked away? Claire hadn't planned on starting over in New Hampshire, much less as someone's secretary at 35. But life, it seemed, rarely consulted her plans. It had been 10 years of marriage, quiet years. Mostly, the kind where arguments didn't explode but dissolved slowly, word by word, until the silence between two people became more permanent than the walls of their home. There had been no children, by choice at first, then by timing, then by distance. And when the final papers were signed, she'd packed 3 suitcases, sold the houseplants to a neighbor, and boarded a train headed east. Hanover wasn't a place she had dreamed about. It was a town her Aunt Ruth had retired to a few years prior, small, clean, and nestled against a snowy quiet that felt oddly forgiving. The kind of place where people still greeted each other at the post office, and the local coffee shop served cookies wrapped in parchment paper, not plastic. Claire stayed in Ruth's guest bedroom for the first month, curled up beside a wood stove that clicked and groaned like it was talking to itself. She read old cookbooks, took long walks, avoided mirrors. Ashford Realty had been the only place hiring. They didn't want experience, just precision. Temporary contract, 6 months, full-time, no promises. She had accepted on the spot. Her first week was a blur of usernames and copier codes, missed staples and wrong font sizes. Everyone around her looked younger, sharper suits, faster typing, shoes that clicked confidently on the tile. Claire kept her head down and filled her notebook with names and routines. She didn't want to impress anyone. She just didn't want to make noise. Her cubicle sat 2 turns from the executive hallway. Neutral tones, recycled air. She brought in a small lamp with a warm bulb and a coaster from her old home faded cork with a ring from too many coffee cups. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Each morning, she arrived 20 minutes early, not because it was required, but because the quiet helped her breathe. She'd wipe down her desk, double-check the day's task list, and organize the pending folders in the exact order of delivery. There was a rhythm in preparation, and Claire had learned to live inside rhythms. Her tasks began small meeting reminders, travel bookings, spreadsheet formatting. Then came the investor packets and the quarterly summaries. She read every document twice, sometimes 3 times, making sure commas sat exactly where they should, names spelled correctly. Even on second reference, she noticed Graham's name appeared often. Of course it did. He was the CEO, but there was something unusual in how others referred to him. Not just Mr. Ashford, but with tones that carried weight, like they were describing a building or a storm system. Some feared him, others admired him. No one seemed to truly know him. Claire never spoke to him directly that first week after the boardroom incident. He passed by her cubicle once, his footsteps silent despite the polished floors. She could feel his presence before she saw him. He didn't look at her, but her hand still trembled as she typed. In the second week, she began receiving small tasks directly from his office, a list of call times, a reprint request, then a handwritten note clipped to a memo, swap the chart on page 4. The rest is fine. She didn't recognize the handwriting at first, firm, slanted, no loops. But the signature was clear, G. Ashford. From that point, Claire began to notice the patterns. His schedule was always tight, but he never liked back-to-back meetings. He preferred bottled water, no ice, no lemon, and disliked cinnamon scents. She kept a sticky note inside her drawer with these details, never sharing them with anyone. By the third week, she had started preparing his folders the way she knew he would want them, even before the requests came in. Charts printed in grayscale unless color was vital, executive summaries on heavier paper stock, sticky tabs for quick navigation. The first time she saw one of her folders returned without edits. She stared at it for several minutes, as if expecting it to vanish. The others in the office didn't seem to notice her small wins. They didn't comment when her charts were praised in meetings or when her formatting was used in the latest pitch. But Claire noticed, and that was enough. She still ate lunch alone, usually at her desk, half a sandwich, one apple, and a thermos of lukewarm tea. But even those moments held a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. No one demanded anything of her here. No one raised their voice. And in the stillness, she began to feel something unfamiliar, steady. One Thursday afternoon, snow began falling around 3 p.m., soft and slow. Claire had just finished preparing the weekly briefing packet when she remembered something. Graham's schedule included a late call with the Singapore office. He often worked late on Thursdays, which meant he would be reaching for a drink sometime around 6:15 p.m. She stood quietly, walked to the kitchenette, and opened the small fridge. There it was, the water he preferred, the exact brand. She'd had to special order it once, when the office ran out. Now, she kept a few tucked behind the others. She placed the bottle on the corner of his desk, label facing forward. No condensation. She didn't expect thanks. She didn't even know if he'd notice it was her. But as she walked back to her cubicle, something inside her settled. That night, the office emptied early because of the weather. Claire stayed behind, checking folders one last time, wiping her desk, aligning the pens in their tray. When she finally stepped out into the cold, the town had gone quiet. Not just quiet in sound, but in feeling, as though everything had paused. Her breath fogged the air. The snow made the street lamps glow like lanterns in a memory. She pulled her coat tighter and walked slowly, not wanting the day to end just yet. As she neared the corner, she glanced back toward the office building. Only one window still glowed on the top floor. She didn't know if he was standing there, but somehow, she knew he'd seen the bottle. Graham Ashford didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence had sharper teeth than anger ever could. The first time Claire heard him speak in full sentences, it wasn't to her. It was during a morning briefing with the department leads. She had been sitting in the back, out of the way, fingers loosely wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea. Graham stood at the head of the table, tall, still, with a presence that seemed to draw the air inward. He didn't gesture. He didn't fidget. His voice was low, smooth like polished stone, and people listened like the words carried weight beyond the numbers on the slides. He didn't tell stories. He issued conclusions. And when he stopped speaking, there was always a pause, as if the room itself needed a second to absorb what had just been said. Claire had never met someone so completely unreadable. People around the office had a name for him, Mr. Freeze. It floated between printer rooms and hallway corners, always said in half whispers. Most delivered it with a smirk, some with caution, but no one ever said it near him. There was a chill that seemed to settle whenever he walked past, as if conversation lost its courage in his presence. Claire had watched it happen more than once, how banter dissolved into silence when he entered a room, how bodies straightened, how laughter turned to throat clearing. But she also saw things others seemed to miss. She noticed how he paused for a fraction of a second before replying when asked a direct question, how his jaw clenched not from anger, but restraint when someone fumbled a presentation. And sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he would glance out the window with an expression that didn't quite match the man people described, a kind of quiet searching. Claire had passed by his office a few times now. It sat at the far end of the executive floor, with a frosted glass door and a plaque that read simply, Ashford, no first name, no title, just his name, as though that was enough. The office itself was elegant in the same way an old library was elegant dark wood, quiet lighting, and space that invited stillness. But what intrigued Claire the most were the doors. 3 of them. One led to a narrow balcony overlooking the river. It was often ajar in the mornings, letting in the scent of pine and cold. Another led to what she assumed was a private file room. She had once seen someone exit carrying blueprints and dusty ledgers. The third door, however, remained a mystery. It was painted the same deep gray as the wall around it and was always locked. No one ever mentioned it. Claire once heard a junior associate joke. Maybe that's where he keeps the bodies. Laughter followed, but short and nervous. Even the jokes didn't travel far in his presence. That Thursday afternoon, Claire had been sorting a stack of revised investment reports. The air outside was heavy with the promise of snow, and the office carried that quiet buzz of people pretending to be busy while counting down to the weekend. Her hands were full, balancing 2 binders and a folder of notes. When she rounded the corner by Graham's office, the hallway was slick with polished floors, and her right heel caught on the edge of the rug. The folder slipped, papers fanned out like startled birds, scattering across the floor just outside his door. She gasped, bending quickly, knees aching slightly from the sudden squat. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, and she muttered apologies to no one in particular. She didn't hear his footsteps, but she saw the black leather shoes stop just inches from her hand. Graham knelt down not fully, just enough, and picked up one of the papers. His fingers brushed the edge, straightening a corner before handing it silently to her. No expression, no words. Just an extended hand and a gaze that met hers for the first time in days. Claire took the page with a soft thank you, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. He nodded once and stepped back inside. The door clicked softly behind him. She gathered the rest of the papers, double-checked the order, and walked back to her desk, with her breath still caught somewhere between ribs and throat. She didn't expect anything else to happen. It had just been a small moment, an accidental closeness. But that evening, after the office lights dimmed and most had gone home, Claire returned from the mailroom and found something on her desk. A folded sticky note, plain and square, placed neatly atop her keyboard. Her name wasn't on it. She opened it with care, half expecting it to be a misplaced memo. Inside, written in that same familiar slanted handwriting, were just 6 words, "Accuracy matters, but so does heart." She read it twice, then a third time. Her eyes pricked with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something adjacent, something that made her sit a little straighter. She opened her drawer, pulled out the small leather-bound notebook she carried everywhere, and tucked the note between 2 pages. She smoothed it flat with her palm, as if to press the moment into memory. For the rest of the evening, she didn't speak to anyone, but her mind replayed that quiet exchange over and over, the brief brush of fingers, the silence that hadn't felt cold. She'd always believed there were 2 kinds of people in the world, those who talked and those who watched. But maybe there was a third kind, people who listened in silence, but not out of disinterest, people who saw more than they said. Storms had always reminded Claire of things she wanted to forget, not the loud, explosive kind that raged and vanished. No, she was used to the quiet ones, the kind that crept in on a whisper and stayed for hours, maybe days, the kind that tapped softly at windows and crawled into corners, bringing with them a chill that wrapped around your bones and stayed there long after the clouds had cleared. That Thursday night, the weather had turned the way it sometimes did in Hanover, without warning. By 4 p.m, the The sky had gone a shade too dark for the hour, and the clouds hung low, heavy with something unsaid. People began to leave early, coats pulled tight, phones buzzing with storm alerts. Claire stayed behind. She always stayed later than she needed to. There was comfort in the quiet after hours, the low hum of machines winding down, the warm lamplight casting soft pools on her desk. It felt like she could finally breathe without performing. The rain came first, gentle at first, like a memory returning slowly, then harder, more insistent. Drops hit the windows in rhythmic bursts, syncing with the flicker of the lights overhead. The building's generator kicked in once, then again, causing the ceiling to buzz briefly before falling back into a hush. Claire stood at the small office kitchenette, cradling a chipped ceramic mug between both hands. Her tea had long gone cold, but she liked the feel of the cup's weight. She leaned slightly against the counter, watching the storm beyond the window. Her reflection stared back, faintly blurred by the rain, softened by shadow. She didn't hear him approach. Graham Ashford moved like that, quiet, without the usual friction of movement most people carried. She noticed the scent of his cologne before anything else, clean, restrained, like cedar and distance. He didn't say anything at first, just stood near the other end of the counter, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed out the same window. Claire didn't look at him, but she knew he was there in the way her shoulders instinctively straightened, the way her breathing adjusted. Outside, lightning stitched a jagged line across the sky, white and fast. Thunder followed close behind, not loud, but deep, like something shifting beneath the earth. Claire flinched, just slightly, a reflex so practiced she hadn't even known she still had it in her. "I don't like storms," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the rain. Still, he said nothing, but she felt him listening. "My father," she began, then stopped. She hadn't meant to speak at all, but something in the air felt looser than usual, as if the storm had shaken something open. She tried again. "My father used to get loud when it rained. Something about the pressure," he said. "The storm would come in, and so would the anger. Doors would slam, drawers too, and I'd just sit there, hoping it would pass." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "I used to count between the thunderclaps, not because I was scared of the storm, but because it helped me not listen to the yelling." Still no response. But not out of apathy. Claire could feel it. Graham wasn't filling the silence, because he understood the weight of a story like that. A few more seconds passed. The room felt thick with memory. Then, finally, he spoke. "You don't have to flinch every time the thunder speaks." Claire blinked. It wasn't said with pity or condescension, just a quiet truth, dropped like a stone in still water. She turned slightly, finally meeting his eyes. He looked the same as always, composed, unreadable, but there was a softness in the line of his mouth, in the way his shoulders weren't so square tonight. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was just this moment, unspoken and unplanned. Another flash lit up the room, followed by thunder that rattled the windows faintly. This time, Claire didn't move. They stood like that for a few more minutes, not talking, not needing to. Just two people with old wounds standing in the warm hush of a too-quiet office, while the world outside poured itself into darkness. Eventually, Graham gave a small nod and left without a word. The door clicked softly behind him. Claire remained. She sipped the cold tea slowly, letting the silence settle again. Her heart felt strange, heavy, but not in a painful way. More like something had shifted inside her, slightly but permanently. She cleaned her mug, wiped the counter, and turned off the kitchenette light. As she walked toward the elevator, she passed by Graham's office. The balcony door was open just an inch, letting in the smell of wet pine and thunder. She didn't look in. Instead, she buttoned her coat and stepped out into the storm. The rain was softer now, almost apologetic. Streetlights glowed in long reflections on the pavement, and the wind had calmed. Claire walked slowly, letting the rain tap against her shoulders, soak the edge of her scarf. She didn't rush. She didn't curl inward. The thunder returned once more, farther away this time. She heard it clearly, but didn't flinch. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a meeting, just 2 nights. Nothing more. Claire had repeated that to herself at least a dozen times as she packed her small suitcase. The request had come casually well, as casual as anything could sound when said by Graham Ashford. He'd stopped by her desk the morning before, folder in hand, voice steady. "We've got a pitch in Charleston Thursday. I'd like you to come handle the materials. 2 nights. You'll be back by Saturday. No smile, no pressure, just fact." Claire had blinked, surprised. Not by the trip itself, executive assistants occasionally traveled, but by the directness. He could have asked anyone. He could have had someone else prepare the documents, but he'd asked her. She wanted to say no. Not because she was unwilling, but because proximity scared her more than distance. At least from afar. She could pretend he didn't unsettle her, but she nodded, quietly. Of course. And now? Here she was, standing in the polished lobby of the Charleston Hotel as the concierge gave an apologetic smile. "I'm afraid we've only got 1 suite left. 2 bedrooms, shared living space, high floor, river view." Graham had glanced at Claire. Unreadable. "That'll do," he said simply, signing the check-in form. Claire's heart had knocked against her ribs like it had lost its rhythm, but she followed him into the elevator, luggage in hand, words carefully tucked behind her lips. The suite was beautiful, understated, like everything Graham seemed to choose. Soft beige walls, dark wood trim, low amber lighting. 2 doors led to separate bedrooms, but between them sat a shared space with wide windows, a muted rug, and a small kitchen tucked beside a round dining table. Claire went to the far bedroom silently, unpacking with the precision she always carried into unfamiliar places. Everything in its place: notebook on the nightstand, chargers by the lamp, slippers tucked under the chair. She changed into soft slacks and a cotton blouse, then gathered the project binder and stepped out to the living room. Graham was already there, seated on the far end of the couch. A tray sat on the coffee table kettle, 2 porcelain cups, and a jar of loose tea. Claire paused. He glanced up. "I figured tea might help," he said. Then, softer, "It's going to storm tonight." As if on cue, thunder rumbled far off, low and slow, like something ancient turning in its sleep. Claire sat across from him, placing the binder between them. They didn't speak for a while. She worked through the documents, sliding pages to him for review. Occasionally, he pointed to a line, tapped a number, or made a small note with his pen. The room was filled with the quiet sounds of paper, rain beginning to tap the windows, and the soft hiss of the kettle. When the tea was ready, Graham poured it without asking. He handed her the cup, gently thumb, just grazing the porcelain. It was warm and fragrant, the kind of tea that smelled like old bookstores and cinnamon. Claire cradled it with both hands. "My mother used to make this blend," he said, staring out the window. "Lemon verbena, a little rosemary." She said it calmed her nerves, especially during storms. Claire looked at him, surprised. She used to hold the cup in both hands. He continued, even when it was too hot to touch. Said it reminded her to breathe slowly. There was something in his voice that she hadn't heard before. Not softness exactly, but distance, as if the memory had floated up without permission. Claire didn't ask questions. She just listened. The storm outside deepened. Rain fell harder now, streaking the glass like whispers. Lightning danced in the distance. The walls of the suite glowed gold under the lamplight, shadows shifting gently. Claire leaned back, letting herself exhale. Then came the thunder, this time louder, closer. She flinched, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that her cup rattled slightly in its saucer. Graham noticed. He rose without a word, disappeared into the hallway, and returned with a soft hotel throw. He draped it over her shoulders gently, smoothing it across her arms. Then he sat beside her, not close enough to touch, but closer than they had ever been. For a long time, neither spoke. They just sat her with the tea, him with his hands loosely folded, both of them looking out into the storm. And in that silence, something changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a small shift in air, like two ships, drifting closer in the same current without even realizing it. Claire didn't know how long they sat there. Time felt different in that space, less urgent, less measured. At some point, her breathing slowed, the thunder came again. And this time, she didn't flinch. Her eyes grew heavy. She curled one leg under her, holding the tea close to her chest, blanket warm around her. The hum of the storm became a lullaby. She wasn't thinking about work, or the pitch, or even the strange arrangement of two people sharing a suite they hadn't chosen. She was thinking about the way he had said, "It'll do," how he had poured tea without asking, how he hadn't filled the silence with meaningless words, how, in all his reserve, he had noticed the smallest shiver in her spine and answered it. And for a moment, Claire let go of the walls she always kept between herself and others. She closed her eyes. She didn't know if he was still sitting there, but as sleep gently pulled her under, she thought, if he is, I hope he stays. By morning, the silence between them had grown legs and followed Claire all the way home. The ride back from Charleston had been quiet, far too quiet for two people who had once shared a storm and a pot of tea. Graham had said nothing beyond the necessary logistics. No mention of the trip, no glance her way. Not even a parting nod as he stepped into the elevator ahead of her at the Hanover office. Claire had stood there for a second too long, still holding her laptop bag, heart thudding as if it had missed a memo. Had she imagined it? The warmth of that suite, the shared memory of his mother's tea, the way he'd placed that blanket on her shoulders, like a promise with no words. Maybe she had. Maybe everything that felt tender in the dim amber light had evaporated under the cold fluorescent glare of Monday morning. Back in her cubicle, the world resumed its rhythm. Phones rang, mice clicked, printers groaned. Claire sat stiffly, eyes darting between inboxes and meeting requests, fingers pausing slightly longer than usual above the keyboard. Her blouse still carried a faint trace of the hotel's linen spray, and she could swear the scent made her stomach turn, not from nausea, but from remembering. At 10:15, Graham's assistant forwarded her a new timeline for Thursday's board prep. No good morning, no thank you for last week, just the task and the deadline. Her name felt hollow on the header line. She stood to retrieve a file from the shared printer, walking slower than usual, her shoes soft against the carpet. As she reached for the folder, she heard it. Two voices, female, whispering, but not well. I mean, come on. You don't just bring your secretary to Charleston unless A, pause, a laugh, clipped and sharp, classic favoritism. Bet she didn't even book her own flight. Claire's hand tightened around the folder's edge. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Her name wasn't said, but it didn't have to be. There weren't many secretaries who had gone to Charleston. In fact, there had only been one. She returned to her desk, each step feeling louder than it should. Her inbox blinked again, subject line, pitch room, logistics. From Graham, brief, clinical. The man who had once spoken of lemon verbena and rosemary was now speaking only in bullet points, and yet her heart twisted at the fact that she still checked every line twice, still read into the timing of his emails, still waited for meaning in the spaces between his words. That afternoon, while consolidating calendar requests, Claire opened a shared scheduling draft. A mistake, really. The kind where your mouse moves faster than your mind. But there it was, an old draft, half deleted but still cached in the system, showing Graham had moved a key investor meeting from Friday to Wednesday. The same week he'd taken her to Charleston. The change had required 3 reschedules. 2 executives moved their flights. She stared at the screen. The meeting could have happened Friday. He'd changed it so it wouldn't, so they could leave Thursday. She sat back in her chair, cold creeping into her chest like a slow leak. Not because she felt special, but because she suddenly felt visible for the wrong reasons. The whispers made more sense now, and they hurt more. 2. By 5. Claire still hadn't spoken to Graham, not a single word exchanged since the trip. She had passed him once in the hall. His gaze was forward, his steps steady, his expression unreadable, not even a flicker, as if she were no one. Back home, she didn't turn on the lights right away. The apartment felt too full of noise, even in its silence. She slipped off her shoes, laid her bag on the chair, and walked straight to the small bathroom. The mirror above the sink was speckled with condensation from the cold. She looked into it as if searching for someone else's reflection. Her face looked the same, hair a bit flat from the day, eyes tired but clear. But inside something had cracked, not from the email, not even from the whispers, from the silence. The silence that had once felt warm beside the storm was now something else entirely. It was distance, deliberate. Claire leaned in closer, resting both palms on the edge of the sink. Her reflection didn't blink. She thought of leaving, thought of what it would mean to pack up again, start over, find another job in another town with fewer eyes and fewer stories. But she didn't move, not yet. Instead, she whispered into the quiet, "I don't know how long I can stay." There are words that live in drafts, never sent. Claire had written hers 3 times now. Each version began the same way: "Dear Mr. Ashford, I'm writing to formally resign from my position at Ashford Realty." And each time, she would pause there, staring at the line like it might blink back at her. The words looked professional, measured, appropriate. But to Claire, they felt like surrender. She would read the sentence aloud in her head, then delete it word by word, sometimes starting over, sometimes letting the cursor blink in place for several minutes before she closed the file entirely. It wasn't that she wanted to leave, not really, but the silence was unbearable. Ever since Charleston, Graham had been Graham again. No warm glances, no quiet gestures, just bullet point emails and calendar changes and hallway nods that didn't quite land. He hadn't mentioned the trip, not once. He hadn't said anything about the blanket, or the tea, or the way they had sat side by side, breathing into the storm like they shared lungs. And maybe they hadn't. Maybe it had only been her. Claire closed her laptop, stood, and moved toward the small shelf by her window. Outside, the branches swayed in a light breeze, leaves catching the late afternoon light, like hands reaching for something they couldn't hold. She ran a thumb along the edge of the notebook where she'd taped the sticky note weeks ago. Accuracy matters, but so does heart. Did he even remember writing that? Or had it been nothing? The thought made her chest tighten, not from heartbreak, but from humiliation. That particular ache of wondering whether something sacred to you was just a passing convenience for someone else. At the office, things felt the same on the surface. Claire arrived early, took notes, organized folders, avoided small talk, but under the surface, everything had shifted. She moved more cautiously now, afraid that even her silence might be misinterpreted. She caught people watching her longer than usual. Whispers died when she entered a room. And Graham, he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and chose not to. That thought kept her awake most nights. One afternoon, while refilling the copier tray, a voice called softly from behind her. "Hey, Claire." She turned. It was Elise from HR, one of the few who ever smiled genuinely. "Can I give you some advice?" Elise said, leaning closer. Claire nodded, unsure. "You're doing a great job," Elise began. "Everyone knows that, but just be careful around Janine." The name made Claire's throat tighten. Elise continued, a little quieter now. "They used to be engaged, years ago, but she still acts like, well, like he belongs to her. She's not exactly subtle." Claire's stomach dropped. "She's been watching," Elise added, "and talking." Claire nodded slowly, whispering, "Thanks." She walked back to her desk, feeling like she'd just stepped into someone else's story, one she had no business being in. Janine, of course. That explained the glances, the tone in the weekly meetings, the way Claire's name had suddenly started appearing in conversations she hadn't been part of. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the shadow of someone else's claim. That night, Claire opened her laptop again. This time, she didn't hesitate. Dear Mr. Ashford, I'm writing to inform you of my intention to resign from my position. Effective. She stopped. Her fingers hovered above the keys. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock. She looked down at her hands steady, practiced, always in control, and then she thought of Charleston. Not the suite, not even the blanket, but the way he had poured her tea, the way he had shared something about his mother, unprompted, the way they had sat in silence, and it hadn't felt empty. She remembered how she had fallen asleep on the couch, her head tilted toward the light, wondering whether he would still be that man in the morning. He hadn't been, but that moment had still existed. And now, the only thing more painful than being unseen was erasing the part of her that had been briefly known. She closed the laptop, stood up, walked to the kitchen drawer, and pulled out a piece of paper. This time, she wrote it by hand, slowly, carefully, like the act itself might help her understand what she really wanted. She didn't write a resignation. She wrote a letter she would never send. It began simply, Graham, I'm not sure you even know what Charleston meant to me, but I do, and I think you did too. She didn't say much more. Just a few lines, then folded it into thirds, pressed it flat, and tucked it into the bottom drawer of her desk at home beneath a stack of old postcards and receipts. She didn't throw it away, but she didn't plan to give it to him, either. Some truths were meant to be kept, like breath in cold air seen, but never touched. The next morning, Claire woke up early, dressed in navy, no makeup, just chapstick. She walked to work with steady steps, the letter still folded where she had left it, but its weight following her like a secret. She didn't know what would happen next. But for now, she would keep showing up until the day she couldn't anymore. Some storms don't come with thunder, just a folder and a smile too sharp to be kind. It happened on a Wednesday. The boardroom was unusually full. Department heads, legal counsel, even 2 visiting partners from the Boston office. Claire had been asked to take notes, like she always was. She didn't mind. It gave her something to do with her hands, somewhere to look when the silence between her and Graham became too much. The meeting had followed its usual course: budget revisions, expansion forecasts, a lukewarm presentation on market trends. Claire typed quietly, seated near the end of the long table, far enough to remain invisible, close enough to hear everything. Then Janine Caldwell stood up. She looked elegant, as always, hair smoothed back into a perfect chignon, a navy dress that matched the folders in her hand. Her heels didn't click. They whispered. I have something that should be addressed before we move forward, she said, voice sweet as polished glass. Graham didn't look up from his notes. Janine opened the folder slowly, the motion deliberate. She pulled out a stapled packet 8 pages thick and placed a copy in front of each board member. It's come to my attention, she began, that there's been a serious breach of professional conduct. Claire froze. Janine continued, calm and methodical, specifically, favoritism and inappropriate use of company resources. She turned, just slightly, and met Claire's eyes with a smile so delicate it cut. There was a recent trip to Charleston, officially for business. But according to these hotel invoices, she tapped the first page, Mr. Ashford and his assistant, Ms. Whitmore, shared a suite. A low murmur rippled through the room. Claire couldn't breathe. They claimed 2 bedrooms, Janine added, voice flat now, but the reservation and room rate suggest otherwise. Another pause, another smile. And since this trip coincided with a rescheduled investor meeting that affected multiple departments, I felt it prudent to bring this before the board. Claire's vision blurred for a moment. She looked at Graham. He didn't move. His eyes were locked on the packet in front of him, face unreadable, lips pressed into a firm line. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. Not once. Someone cleared their throat. A chair shifted. Papers rustled. And then silence. Heavy, tense, cracking at the edges. Claire could feel the weight of every glance in the room, some curious, some judgmental, some already convinced. Her hands trembled in her lap. She couldn't find her voice, couldn't form a sentence. Her mouth was dry, her throat closed like a fist. She didn't know what hurt more, the accusation itself, or the fact that no one questioned it, not even him. She waited for Graham to speak, to lift his head, to say something, anything that might slice through the humiliation beginning to burn under her skin, but he didn't. Not even when someone asked, "Mr. Ashford, do you have a comment on this?" He looked up then, briefly. His jaw was tight, his eyes colder than she'd ever seen. "We'll address it internally," he said. "Let's move on." That was it. No denial, no clarification, no mention of the 2 bedrooms, or the project binders, or the space they'd kept between them. Just cold professionalism and silence. Claire stood up, not loudly, not abruptly, just enough to be noticed. She gathered her notepad with fingers that barely worked, nodded slightly to the room out of some instinct for manners, and walked out. No one stopped her. She didn't cry. Not yet. She walked down the hallway with practiced grace, each step more painful than the last. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows on the floor. Her heels clicked no longer whispers, but echoes. Inside the restroom, she locked the stall and sat down on the closed lid. Only then did the tears come, quiet, controlled, a stream, not a storm. She covered her mouth with both hands, as if the sound might betray her further. In 10 minutes, she washed her face, fixed her hair, and walked back to her desk like nothing had happened. But something had, something she couldn't unhear, couldn't unfeel, couldn't forget. That evening, her apartment felt too still. She didn't take off her coat right away, just stood in the kitchen, letting the silence press in from all directions. She opened her laptop. This time, she didn't hesitate. "Dear Mr. Ashford, I am writing to formally resign from my position at Ashford Realty. Effective." She stopped, not because she doubted, but because her hands shook. She reached for her notebook, the one with the sticky note still tucked between pages. Accuracy matters, but so does heart. What a cruel thing to say. Now, she closed the book. This time, there was no tea, no warmth, no storm to soften the silence. Just a betrayal that didn't even have the dignity of a name. She finished typing the letter, signed it, saved it, didn't print it, not yet. But she would. She knew she would. Because sometimes silence isn't quiet. It's a scream you're forced to swallow. Snow had fallen overnight, covering everything, but it couldn't cover the ache in Claire's chest. The world outside her window looked soft, almost kind, blanketed in white like a fresh page. But inside her, nothing felt clean or new. There was only the heaviness of what had been said, and what hadn't. She had woken early, before the sun had fully risen, before the sidewalks had been salted or the roads cleared. Her apartment was still half dark, the heater humming low, her breath visible in the kitchen light as she brewed a pot of tea she didn't intend to drink. The resignation letter lay folded beside the teapot. Plain white envelope, her handwriting small but steady on the front. To Mr. Graham Ashford, from Claire Whitmore. There were no flourishes, no hesitation, no second note hidden beneath. She slipped on her boots slowly, tugged her coat tight around her. Scarf, gloves, hat. The movements were mechanical now, one after another, like closing chapters. Outside, the snow came up past her ankles in places. The streets were quiet. Only a few tire tracks cut through the soft cover, winding toward office buildings and early shifts. She walked. Each step was deliberate, careful. There was something reverent about moving through untouched snow, like walking through silence made visible. When she reached the building, the front lobby was still dark. Security lights glowed blue near the elevators. She didn't stop. She knew the way by heart. Graham's office sat at the end of the executive wing, door always closed, always locked before Ada. M. Claire paused there, envelope in hand. She didn't cry. She didn't even shake. She just bent down and slid the letter gently under the door, then turned and walked away. She didn't look back. The snow had grown heavier by the time she stepped outside again. Flakes clung to her coat, melted into her scarf. The cold bit at her cheeks, sharp and honest. She welcomed it. Every footstep left an imprint behind her, a trail she didn't try to erase. The world was hushed, trees bent under white weight, shop windows frosted from inside. The town moved slower under snow, as if it too needed a moment to grieve. Claire didn't take the main road home. She turned down a side street narrow and lined with old brick homes, each with wreaths still hanging from the holidays. A few porch lights flickered softly, fighting the gray morning. As she walked, her mind drifted back to Charleston, back to that night, back to the sound of thunder rolling low across the sky and the warmth of a blanket across her shoulders. She remembered Graham's hands, how careful they were when he'd poured tea, the way he hadn't tried to fill the silence with explanations or apologies, just presence. That had been enough, until it wasn't. She tightened her scarf and kept walking. By the time she reached her apartment, her boots were soaked through. She peeled them off by the door, set them gently on the mat, hung her coat, untied her scarf with slow fingers. The silence of her living room wrapped around her like another layer of snow, quiet, unbroken. She lit the fireplace, the old kind, wood and matches. It took a few tries, but eventually the flame caught, small and stubborn. The kettle whistled from the kitchen. Claire poured herself a cup of tea, not from the new blend she kept for guests, but from the old tin her mother had once favored. The label had faded, the lid dented at one corner. She didn't care. She chose a mug with a small chip on the rim, the one her mother had always used, the one that still smelled, faintly, like lavender and years. She sat on the rug by the fire, legs crossed, tea cupped in both hands, and for the first time in a long time, she let the stillness come. No phone, no thoughts racing ahead, no Graham, just the weight of everything she'd carried, and the quiet, brave choice to finally set it down. Enough, she whispered, to no one, and she meant it. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the fire cracked softly, scenting the room with cedar and quiet resolve. Claire leaned back against the armchair, her tea cooling slowly in her hands. She wasn't thinking of what came next. Not yet. She just let herself be still. Then, a sound, not loud, not frantic, just a knock. 3 soft raps at the front door. She looked up, startled. For a moment, she wondered if she'd imagined it, but then it came again clearer now, insistent only in its presence. Claire stood slowly, the tea forgotten on the floor, the fire flickering behind her, the snow still falling outside. She walked to the door, hand on the knob, breath caught, and waited. He hadn't come for apologies. He came for the truth. When Claire opened the door, snow still clung to her porch steps. The air outside was hushed, like the world had paused just long enough to hold its breath. Graham Ashford stood there, tall against the gray morning, coat unbuttoned despite the cold. His gloves were off, tucked under one arm, and in his bare hand, slightly creased and damp at the corner, was the envelope, the letter, her letter. He didn't speak right away, just held it out not like an accusation, but like a question. Claire stepped aside without a word. He entered slowly, gaze skimming the familiar edges of her home, the wooden floor, the worn armchair, the fire still glowing in the hearth. The tea mug sat half full, forgotten on the rug. He didn't sit. Claire folded her arms, suddenly unsure of what she wanted to say. He broke the silence first. I read it twice, then folded it, then opened it again. She nodded. His voice was low, rougher than usual. I shouldn't have waited this long. Claire took a breath, steady and thin. But you did. He looked at her, then, fully, the way he hadn't since Charleston. I didn't come to explain. He said, I came to tell the truth. She raised an eyebrow. About what? About why I didn't defend you. About why I let that room sit in silence. Claire swallowed, hard. Her heart ached with the echo of that day. I thought it was shame, she said, or guilt. It was fear, he answered quietly. That word hung in the air like smoke. Fear of what her voice cracked despite herself. He stepped forward, carefully. His hands remained at his sides, still holding the envelope like it anchored him. Fear of how much you meant, he said. How much I had already let you in. Claire's arms dropped to her sides. She didn't speak. Graham looked down, then back up again, eyes darker now, but not cold. I've lost people before. My mother, first, cancer. I was 26. She was the only person who ever softened me. Then my fiancé left, said I was too closed off, too distant. She wasn't wrong. Claire listened, no judgment in her expression, only stillness. After that, he continued. I stopped letting anyone close, not even professionally. I built walls inside walls, doors no one had keys to, until the fire popped behind them, one sharp crack like punctuation. You walked into a room you weren't supposed to enter, he said, and suddenly, everything was rearranged. Claire looked down at her hands. They were clasped tightly, knuckles pale. I wasn't trying to change anything, she whispered. I know, he said. Silence stretched again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything unsaid. Claire finally asked, So, why didn't you speak up when it mattered? Graham looked at her, this time with something more vulnerable behind his eyes. Because I wasn't ready to admit what it meant. Not to them, not even to myself. She let out a breath, half laugh, half pain. You thought silence would protect you, and I didn't realize, he said gently, that it would hurt you instead. Her throat tightened. It did. Graham stepped back, just slightly. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, and I won't ask you to stay. You don't owe me that. Claire blinked, tears brimming but unshed. But I needed to tell you, he said, that your presence in my life wasn't a favor, or an accident, or something I took for granted. He placed the letter on the side table. I didn't fall for your work ethic, or your organization skills, or your tea preferences. Her breath caught. I fell, he said softly, because in a world full of closed doors, you never asked to be let in. You just showed up, and somehow, that was enough. Claire looked at him, her face trembling now, not with anger, but with the fragile weight of understanding. I hated you, she said quietly, for leaving me to drown in that room. I know, but I think, she paused, I think I hated myself more for believing you'd never do that. Graham stepped closer. You were right to believe better of me, he said. I just wasn't ready to be that person yet. The tears came then, soft and slow, not from betrayal, but from recognition. She wiped them quickly. Why now? He didn't answer right away, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of notepaper. Claire took it carefully. He said, I wrote that last night. I didn't know if I'd leave it at your door, or hand it to you myself. He turned toward the exit, stepping quietly. I'll go now, he added, pausing at the door. But I meant every word. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Claire stood still. She unfolded the note, 4 words, written in his careful, slanted hand. You made me want to open windows again. Her hand covered her mouth. She didn't cry. Not this time. She sat down by the fire, the letter in her lap, the silence no longer heavy, just full. By Monday morning, Claire thought she'd let go. She was wrong. She had come into the office with her head high, her heart sealed in something steady and quiet. The air outside was crisp, the sidewalks finally clear of snow. It felt like an ordinary day until it didn't. At 8:45, an all-staff email arrived. Subject company-wide meeting, 9:00 a.m. Main conference room, mandatory attendance. Claire's stomach sank. She wasn't the only one who felt it. The whispering began almost immediately. Shoes clicked faster on the tile. Coffee cups sat untouched. Doors opened and closed with nervous rhythm. She followed the others to the conference room, her steps even, but her hands were cold. Inside, the room was already filling. Faces she'd seen 100 times now looked unfamiliar under the fluorescent light tight, expectant, some unreadable. She took a seat near the back. Janine was there, lips painted, posture perfect, eyes unreadable. Graham wasn't, not yet. The door closed at exactly 9:00. Then he walked in. No assistant, no folder, just him, in a charcoal suit and the kind of stillness that commanded the room without effort. The murmurs died instantly. He moved to the front, not behind the podium, but beside it. Claire held her breath. He looked around the room, not rushed, not rehearsed. His eyes settled briefly on Claire, just long enough to anchor her. Then he spoke. "There's been a lot of noise these past few weeks." He began, some loud, some quiet, and I've let most of it stand. His voice was calm, even, but underneath it was something more, an edge that didn't come from anger, but from conviction. "I made a mistake," he said, "not in company policy, not in operations, but in silence." The room held its breath. He continued, slower now. "There was a situation brought up at a previous board meeting. Accusations were made, and I stayed quiet, thinking professionalism meant detachment. That feelings had no place in this space." He looked directly at Janine, then just for a second. Her gaze didn't meet his. "But I was wrong," he said. Claire's heart pounded. "I was wrong," he repeated, voice firmer, "to let my fear of perception override the truth." He turned back to the room. "And the truth is, I took a trip to Charleston with my assistant. We shared a suite with 2 bedrooms. We worked late into the night. We didn't cross any lines except the one where something started to matter." Claire's hands trembled slightly in her lap. He took a breath. "I didn't abuse my position. I didn't exploit my role. But I did fall in love." There it was. No preamble, no apology for the word. "I fell in love with someone who showed up when she didn't have to, who stayed kind in rooms that weren't kind to her, who brought not just competence, but grace." The silence in the room shifted. It wasn't tense anymore. It was reverent. I didn't say this earlier because I was afraid it would cost me something. Respect, control, image. But what it nearly cost me was far more important. He turned toward Claire fully now. And that's her. Her heart was pounding so loudly she thought it might drown out his voice. "I'm not making this announcement to win approval," he said, "or to excuse silence. I'm saying it because she deserves someone who would stand up not just in private, but when it counted." His gaze didn't leave her. "I made a mistake staying silent, but not loving her. That was never a mistake." Someone inhaled sharply. A pen dropped. No one spoke. Claire felt her chest rise, fall. Rise again, like learning how to breathe in a new way. Janine stood suddenly. She didn't say a word, just gathered her notebook and walked toward the door with carefully measured grace. No one stopped her. No one looked away from Graham. When the door clicked shut behind Janine, the room remained still. Graham didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. He gave Claire one last look, a look without pressure, without expectation, just a space, an invitation. Then he stepped back, letting the silence settle where his voice had been. Claire didn't speak. She couldn't. But she stood slowly, not rushed, not shaky. And she nodded, just once. It was enough. Because sometimes a nod is louder than words. Sometimes it means I see you. I believe you. I'm still here. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by walls that had once felt so cold, Claire realized something had shifted, not just in the room, but in her. Trust had taken root again, not because of a grand gesture, but because someone had finally stood still, turned around, and said her name with honesty. She didn't smile, not yet, but something in her eyes softened, and Graham saw it. Whatever came next, they would carry it not as proof, but as presence, not as spectacle, but as something real, something worth standing up for. She had always felt invisible in rooms that mattered, not anymore. It had been a quiet week. Claire didn't return to the office, not officially. No announcement was made, no email sent, but her badge still worked. Her name hadn't been removed from the staff directory. No one asked her to stay away, and no one rushed her to return. Instead, a handwritten invitation arrived in her mailbox. Winter Gathering, Ashford Realty. Friday at 6:30 p.m. Venue, the Old Mill House. No signature, just a folded note inside. You're still part of this. She recognized Graham's handwriting. Friday came with the kind of cold that painted everything in silver. The air was still, the sky overcast. Snow was expected again by nightfall. Claire stood by the window in her apartment, the hem of her dress brushing her ankles. Deep green velvet, simple, classic. Ruth's brooch at her collar. She hadn't worn it in years. At exactly 6 Onger headlights cast a soft glow across her porch. Not a driver, not a car service. Graham. He stepped out, coat buttoned high, a scarf tucked beneath. No suit jacket tonight, no briefcase, just the man who had once folded her resignation letter like it was something fragile. Claire opened the door before he could knock. For a moment, they just stood there, not as boss and employee, not as scandal and defense, just two people. You look, he began, then stopped, not because he couldn't finish, but because words felt too small. She smiled gently. You too. He didn't reach for her hand, didn't rush her down the steps. He just walked beside her. The road to the old mill house was lined with lanterns, soft yellow light spilling onto snow. Inside, the wooden beams were strung with garlands and pine. A fire crackled at the far end of the room. People mingled, laughed. Some glanced at her when she entered, but not with judgment, with curiosity, and, perhaps, something else. Recognition. Claire moved through the crowd slowly. Familiar faces greeted her. Some nodded, some smiled. Some offered small words like, "Glad you came," or "Nice to see you again." But no one whispered behind cupped hands anymore. Graham stayed nearby, never too close, never too far. When the music softened and the murmurs dimmed, someone called for the annual toast. Graham stepped up to the small platform, not with notes, not with a speech, just a glass in hand and a calmness in his posture. "Good evening," he began, voice steady. "Thank you all for coming. This year has been different." A few polite chuckles, but also important. He glanced briefly across the room, eyes landing, briefly, on Claire. "This year, I learned something I should have known sooner, that success doesn't come from never making mistakes, but from being willing to grow past them." A pause. "This year, I found something more valuable than any deal, any contract, any quarterly report." He smiled not wide, but true. A reason to hope again. The room was still. And Claire. She smiled too. Not for show, not because anyone was watching, but because something warm moved through her chest, like sunlight cracking through frost. The toast ended. Glasses clinked. Music rose again. Claire stepped outside for a moment, letting the cool air meet her face. The sky had begun to snow just lightly, flakes dancing in the amber porch light. She wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders and turned toward the railing. Graham found her there, minutes later. He didn't speak. Just stood beside her, their elbows nearly brushing. They watched the snowfall together. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quietly. "Not tonight, not even tomorrow." Claire didn't answer. "I just wanted you to know," he continued, "that when you walked into that boardroom and into my life, I didn't realize you were what I'd been waiting for." She closed her eyes for a breath and opened them again with clarity. I didn't want to be someone you needed, she said. I wanted to be someone you saw. Graham looked at her then, fully. You were, he said. You are. She didn't cry, not this time. They returned inside, shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but not apart. And in the low light of the evening, under garlands and laughter, Claire opened her small leather-bound notebook. Inside, 3 folded notes, one from the first time he'd helped her pick up scattered papers. Accuracy matters, but so does heart. One from the day he didn't speak, but left a tea bag in her cup. Your steadiness is the calm this place needs. And the last, tucked beneath the flap, from after he walked away from her door. You made me want to open windows again. She hadn't been rescued. She had been seen. And that made all the difference. Later that night, as she walked home beneath a sky now glowing faintly with snowfall, Claire felt something shift. Not everything had healed, not everything would, but the cold didn't bite so hard, and the silence didn't press in so close. She passed the spot where he'd waited outside her porch that snowy morning. She paused there, then smiled, because this time, the snow didn't feel like a storm. Sometimes, the greatest ache doesn't come from being unloved, but from being unseen. Claire's story reminds us that silence can hurt as deeply as cruelty, and presence alone is not the same as connection. In a world that moves too fast, it's easy to feel invisible, especially when we're older, softer, or have learned to quiet our needs for the sake of others. But dignity lives in being acknowledged for who we truly are, not just for what we do. This story isn't about grand gestures or perfect endings. It's about the quiet courage to stay kind in rooms that weren't built for us, the power of honesty even when it arrives late, and the healing that begins the moment someone sees us fully and chooses not to look away. No matter your age, it's never too late to be seen, to speak your truth, or to allow someone in not to fix you, but to witness you. So, if you're holding something unsaid in your heart, maybe today is the day to let it out. Because being seen is not about spotlight, it's about being known softly, honestly, and without condition. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of Claire's story. If her journey moved you even just a little, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Every story we tell is meant to touch a quiet corner of your heart. And with your support, we'll continue bringing more voices, more healing, and more light to the world.